Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Social Environment Lunchtime conversation. Today, I'm so delighted to have William Adams, who I have met through Alex and Ada Katz. I think must have been in 2010 at the lavish luncheon, the annual luncheon at Colby Museum, Colby College, where William had been the president from 2000 to 2014 upon his retirement, from which point President Obama had appointed him as the 10th chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd like to offer less of formal introduction, partly because everything William had accomplished in his life is an embodiment of a personal odyssey, I would say, rather than a linear path to the ultimate desirable career. I'm very much interested in the art and humanity for a long time in terms of how they apply to publication like the Rail, the so-called alternative voices. So there are needs to ask questions specifically for myself, but I hope that after we maybe 50 or an hour talk, we hope that you would join in and ask your own question. So I like to essentially turn quickly over Sophia for a quick housekeeping note before we begin very, very soon. Sophia?
Wonderful. Thank you, Phong. Hello, I'm Sophia Pedlow. I'm the Managing Director at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. A few quick notes before we get rolling. We'll be recording this meeting for the Rail archive, so if you would prefer not to be seen, you can disable your camera by pressing the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your screen. We'll keep the audience on mute until question time, which will kick off about 45 minutes or so into the talk. Please take a moment to introduce yourself and say where you're from in the chat. If you have questions while the conversation's happening, I'll be collecting those up and calling on you come the Q&A session. John will be helping out with tech in case it's needed, and our lovely production assistants, Everett and Malvika, will be typing closed captions should you wish to enable those in the bottom chat bar. A special thanks to Sycamore Jenkins and Co-Gallery for sponsoring today's talk. And now back to Phong and William.
So thank you, Sophia. Okay, I'm very impressed with William. Like I say, non-linear path is an odyssey, like an artist, creative individual. He's a born product of an auto industry in Birmingham, Michigan. Began with an ambiguous desire to leave home. I don't know why, but were asked why he gone to 1 year in Colorado College, and then enrolled the U.S. Army for 2 years, plus 1 year in Vietnam, as an infantry advisor in the Mekong Delta. We spoke the other day when my family was sent to labor camp, and I was impressed how he remembered the village near Kai Be in the Tiên Giang province. It was only when William returned to the U.S. that may have been in May 1966, correct me if I'm wrong, William, that you encountered the Berkeley protest, the People's Park Bloody Thursday, that somehow had a significant impact on you. I know that you came back and studied with the philosopher Glenn Ray, who has similar experience as you did, because he served the U.S. Army as a counterintelligence in the Second War, during which time it really changed him. And then later on, he wrote that memoir I just ordered online the other day, the Warrior's Reflection on Men in Battle, with the introduction of Hannah Arendt. So let's talk about that a little bit before we jump on to your Merleau-Ponty project at the current right now that you're working on.
Well, you're generous to say that my life has been an odyssey. It's certainly been a winding road, but that point in my life, that early time in my life after being in college and some confusion, I went into the Army and had a rich, I would say, a rich but complex experience, including a year in Vietnam, as you mentioned. And when I came back, I was pretty motivated to do better in college than I'd done before. So I went back to Colorado College, and as you pointed out, I met this wonderful man, Glenn Gray, who had been in World War II for 3 years, actually served in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, and then in France. And he wrote this extraordinary memoir when he came back, which I think is probably one of the best books ever written on war. And I became pretty close to him and some other philosophers at Colorado College who were also very important to me. And I fell in love with philosophy, and that's been my sort of abiding interest intellectually across my entire career. But it wouldn't have happened the way it happened if it hadn't been for Colorado College, for Glenn Gray, and the background of those experiences I had, both in the United States and in Vietnam during that time. You mentioned the People's Park moment. I came back in May of 1969 and met up with some friends, and we went over to Berkeley to see about one of my friends transferring from UCLA. And I'd been back about 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the day that James Rector, protester, was shot and killed on Telegraph Avenue. And we got to the campus, and it was in the midst of a riot that had been caused by this festering conflict at People's Park. And it wasn't really very much different from Vietnam in that moment and event. So it was a very bracing kind of return to the US, and it alerted me to how deeply divided the country had become, which divisions, by the way, I don't think resonated at any point as strongly as they do now. They're not exactly the same divisions. But I don't think the country has been as divided since that time as it is now. Mm-hmm. And I think there are echoes now of some of the divisions in the late 60s. But it was quite a time in the life of the country, and quite a challenging time in my own life, but a rich one as well.
Yeah, we will definitely come back to what happened in the 60s, that decade. Definitely in the late 60s, particularly in the height of Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, among other social and political unrest. But can we just now focus a little bit on why Merleau-Ponty? I know that you go to University Santa Cruz to do your Ph.D. In the history of conscious program there, quite well known. But why Merleau-Ponty, and what does that mean now that having done what you have done, coming back and writing a book about his accomplishment, philosophical enterprise, and relation to Cézanne, among other things?
Well, I first read Merleau-Ponty in the senior seminar that was taught by Glenn Gray at Colorado College. He was a Heidegger scholar, among other things, and so he was very interested in contemporary philosophy. And among the other writers that we read in that sequence, in that seminar, was Merleau-Ponty. And I don't know, there was something about his voice and his way of thinking that caught my attention almost immediately. I think it was also that his professional life had been profoundly changed by the World War II and the experiences that he'd had in the war and after the war. And he wrote an amazing essay right after the end of World War II called "The War Has Taken Place." And it is all about how differently he came to see the world in the wake of that conflagration across Europe and indeed around the world. And it politicized him in a very strong way. And that spoke to me. And it also, I think, brought philosophy for him down to earth and made him very interested in the most concrete aspects of human experience. And so it was that point of view and that kind of interest that spoke to me, in addition to the extraordinary literary qualities of his writing. So I got the bug, and I never lost it. It's still there.
Yeah, we'll pick up on Merleau-Ponty in a while. And as I say, I'm going to jump in different aspects and question whatnot to make it a little bit more or less not linear, as your career has.
Well, it hasn't been linear, believe me.
Well, my similarly, and I hope the rail is that way too. We are very much aspire the idea to adopt, to essentially reflect upon the condition of surrounding issue of the day or the month or the week and whatnot. Let me ask you, when you came to the NEH in 2014, when President Obama invited you to be the chair, I know that you created the Common Good, the initiative, the Common Good Humanity in Public Square. You launched that, and can you share with us what the impulse and the desire behind that initiative so we can understand a little bit more broadly?
Sure, happy to do that. So I retired from Colby in 2014, and I was nominated for the chairmanship of NEH in April, I think it was, of that spring. And I had about 2.5 or 3 months to think about what I wanted to do between the point of the nomination and the Senate confirmation, which is a process that takes a long time. And so I had a couple of months while I was finishing my work at Colby to think about what it is I thought mattered about and in the humanities and what I wanted to accomplish. And this was the moment at which, the humanities were beginning to understand how deep and profound was and is the crisis into which those disciplines had fallen. And so it seemed to me imperative that I find a way, without using the word crisis, which I didn't really like.
Yeah.
But I found a way as chairman to use the resources of the foundation to address some of these public concerns about the relevance of the humanities and their importance, not just in the educational world, but in the broader world as well. I'd had a very good education, particularly at Colby, in museum life and work, and NEH has forever, since the beginning, been very invested in museums. So I knew that these questions about the relevance of the humanities had a lot to do, not just with colleges and universities and schools, but with these big and small important institutions across the country. Museums and libraries and cultural organizations, historical sites, all of those kinds of institutions that sort of compose our cultural life together as Americans. And so I started thinking hard about what needed to happen. And I decided that we needed to have a major initiative at NEH about the public value and the public relevance of the humanities. Why do these ways of understanding the world matter to the country? Why do they matter not just to academics and to intellectuals or to professionals in the cultural sector?
Yeah.
But why do they matter to everyone? So when I got to the agency and I was finally confirmed in July of 2014, I immediately brought my colleagues there together, wonderful people with whom I had terrific working relationships over the period of time I was there. And I challenged them to think about how we could use the grant-making programs of the agency to advance the public interest of the humanities in these kinds of ways. And the result was a whole series of interrelated programs that went on. Some of them are still going on, I'm pleased to say, that were aimed exactly at showing how important the humanities are to the broader public world in which we all live all over the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really the impetus. And it took a number of years for us to work these things out, but we did work them out. And I think some of the programs that we developed were pretty consequential. Just to give a couple of examples, one of the programs we created is still called the Public Scholars Program. And it was to incentivize humanists, writers, intellectuals to write books not for their professional colleagues so much, as for the broader public. And that led to a series of fellowships to writers who have done extraordinary things with the grants that they got from NEH. And so forth across all of the programs at the foundation. So it was a very productive effort, and I think we made some progress in showing to the American people how much their cultural institutions matter, how important it is for them to understand their history and their cultural legacy. And I'm pleased to say that some of those efforts continue.
Well, when I'm glad that you gave that very clear response. And when I was thinking about the notion of public square as how the initiative was implied in some way, does it have roots? Like I'm thinking immediately of John Dewey, for example, the idea of participatory democracy. You know, how he grew up in Burlington, Vermont. In those days, you know, people would meet, public meeting in a place where everyone can voice their concern, whatever issue that were on their mind. I mean, it was a really coming together the community. Similarly, I guess the only person who really advocate for this is the late philosopher Richard Rorty and his friend Habermas. Habermas invented the term similarly called public sphere.
Right.
Well, I'm thinking this, does it have root, your initiative, William, does it have root in everyday democratic practices of ordinary people, the kind of professed social reforms that were set forth by what would be considered best American tradition, from Jefferson, from Emerson, from Walt Whitman to William James. I'm reading William James right now, and John Dewey, you know, of course. And Dewey was very interesting to me right now because he was born in 1859. It was the same year that Darwin Origin of Species was published. So there's two things that cry out for, you know, for Dewey idea, if it need to be brought to, you know, accessible language and clarity. One is that he was probably the only American among the philosophers who was so successful in terms of bringing the synthesis between Hegel historicism and Darwin naturalism. And he tried in his entire productive life to materialize them, mobilize those ideas. I mean, he and his wife, for example, Alice, created that amazing laboratories school in Chicago University where he taught, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, that was an amazing thing he did, but also he's just somebody who had lived through, I mean, a long time. I mean, he didn't die till 1952. So he had already have experienced the Civil War. He's already, you know, have gone through of course, the First War, and then led to the Great Depression era for sure. And then subsequently Second World War. And then the atomic bomb dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That was part of the discourse too. When you talk about Merleau-Ponty earlier, that was part of the moral duties among philosophers, where the people in England like Bertrand Russell or Heidegger, who just came to Oxford then, but Merleau-Ponty and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, these are philosophers who had moral conviction and wanted to get their idea out to the public urgently. There was no interference of academic practice that devoid them from doing so. So my question is that how does that work for you when the initiation worked for the Common Good program? I mean, I'm happy that you did what you did and some of this still going, but how can we get more of those colleagues, friends, most of whom we also admire very much, but their practice is so much well kept in the academy. So how do we break that open a little bit more? I know you did the best you can.
Well, It's going to take a lot of people working a long time to break it open in the way that you're talking about. It's interesting you mentioned Dewey. When I got to the agency and I was working out these ideas, I went back and I read Dewey again, and William James, and Rorty too, or some snippets of Rorty, and that was all very meaningful to me. And for me, in that setting and in that sort of broad national context, this was all about democratic life and democratic citizenship, and how you teach citizenship, and what skills, what understandings, what intellectual capacities are important for democratic citizens. And there are three, I think, that are fundamental. One, you have to understand something about your history. You have to understand, secondly, something about democratic political theory. You have to understand the principles of democratic life and how those principles work themselves out in concrete political situations and institutions. And you have to understand something about your culture. That is to say, the culture now, the elements of your culture now. Who is there? What are their backgrounds? What are their traditions? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that one of the really critical cleavages we're experiencing now as a country is the difficulty of speaking across cultural experience and cultural context. It's a complicated place. It's always been a complicated place. So this question of pluralism, pluralistic democracy, has always been there and much discussed, but it is particularly powerful today. And I don't think you can address any of these things without engagement with the humanities, with history, with these political principles and values, and with these cultural registers and dimensions of our current life. Mm-hmm. And that's where schools have to be very, very committed and very engaged from the very beginning to the very end. And they have to understand citizenship as a principal component of the mission. And the thing that we're living through, of course, is that we're letting go of those commitments in all of these educational contexts, where education for citizenship is taking a less and less central place in our educational institutions, replaced in many cases by technical and professional disciplines. There's nothing to say against technical, professional, and scientific disciplines. We're living through this incredible moment right now where we're really getting a pretty good view of how important our medical scientists are, our epidemiologists, and that all matters too. But we have to get back to this idea of understanding how we educate the whole person. And that's where this great, rich, democratic tradition that you're talking about, including people like Dewey, is so important, because that was always uppermost in his mind. You know, as we make the argument about the importance of the humanities in all of these educational settings, we also have to be walking the talk or talking the walk. We have to be demonstrating in our own lives why and how this matters. So one of the things I tried to talk a lot about as I visited colleges and universities was and is the importance of humanities professionals in those settings, and not just in colleges and universities, I think museum settings and library settings too, is finding a way to engage the public more consistently and effectively around all of these kinds of questions, and particularly for American academics in the humanities, to speak to the public in accessible ways that are clearly connected to the things that people are living with. Mm-hmm. It's natural, I think, in some ways, for academics particularly, to become embedded in professional conversations that are quite technical, mm-hmm. and that are not particularly mindful of who is listening and who can understand the meaning of what's being talked about. But we have to get better at that. And some of the things we did at NEH were aimed at encouraging educators, academics, to become better speakers about the importance of the humanities publicly, and to demonstrate in their teaching and in their research what's at stake in these humanistic disciplines.
Yeah, so the question I remember in your interview with Martha Nussbaum, she spoke about the disappearance of less and less of magazine, periodicals, journals. So when her graduate student or her PhD student having encouraged to write clearly, to write in a way that everyone can understand, like the way that Louis did it. I think there's a whole tradition of early great philosopher or writers, whether Lionel Trilling or John Dewey, Maya Shapiro and Mary McCarthy. In the 30, the 40, the 50, there was so many magazine and journal readily to publish their voices, whether Marxist Quarterly, the New Masses leading to Partisan Review, Dissent Magazine. So there was many, and now we don't have it. So it's very hard for Martha to basically tell her student, well, this is where you can write. This is where you can sharpen up your own style, accessible style, to mobilize your idea to working class people, to ordinary people who can have an idea what you're talking about to share with. But the late 60s came to a tail end because of the Vietnam War. A lot of radical left, the best one of them, moved to academia, to the academy. And that's where they can mobilize the idea, but it's gradually lose footing to more insular, hermetic, tiny community within the even more tiny community within. So they lost the discourse with the working class people. That's one thing that we know the right was very good at. They knew if they can put the lab in the academy, they have a better chance to communicate with the mass of America, especially in rural America. So, I don't know how to frame it readily, but I feel like if I go back from time to time, William, for example, last week I reread, of course, Whitman, 1871 famous Democratic Vista.
Yeah.
And then again, I read that and I felt like a need to read again, Horace Kellan, 1915, Democratic or Democracy versus the Melting Pot. I love the idea of cultural pluralism and the way that he compared it as a symphony in which every musician instrument should be at its best and its own tone or voices without losing any of that origin. And yet it was part of the symphonic sound. And I think that's like one of the best metaphor in a way. And I don't know why that had lost its energy by the late 60s.
Well, I'm not sure I know entirely either. I would just, you mentioned Martha Nussbaum, who's led an admirable life as a public intellectual, and I think she modeled her own work on the notion of being a public intellectual. But there are fewer and fewer, as she's the first to say, and there are fewer and fewer venues in which public intellectuals can speak that have broad connectivity to big pieces of the American public. The whole question of reading now is pretty fraught, and how people get their information, how they consume information, those are questions that are occupying lots of social scientists and lots of humanists. But it's a really, really tremendous problem in both directions. I think, again, I don't mean to repeat myself, but I think academics in the humanities need to take this question of the public intellectual very seriously. Mm-hmm. And they need to start to think of themselves in a different register than they have perhaps since the 60s. And universities, by the way, since I was a college administrator, I should say, need to begin to value that work differently and more than they have typically in the past. I think there are signs that in major institutions, that's beginning to happen a little bit, but we have a very, very long way to go. And so this whole question of how intellectuals in the humanities speak to publics, where the publics are, what the publics are reading, what the publics are consuming is vexing. And of course, it's connected to the whole digital, the giant question of the digital world and how that has changed very, very basically all of the ways in which we relate to one another, but in which we also receive and consume information.
Yeah, in the same interview with Martha Nussbaum, and she mentioned about the healthy business culture that welcome criticism and dissenting voices. Otherwise, it would lead to a culture of complacency, a culture where whistleblowers are discouraged. But then I was thinking, while she was talking about business sectors, I was thinking, what about counterculture? What happened to the whole notion, the idea of counterculture? Because we know it was so essential to the time that you just came back from Vietnam, attending to college and absorbing all of the political issue of the day. What about that importance of counterculture? What about, we know there's an official mainstream culture, there's a culture of priests, culture of academic, business people, and the state. But the counterculture, the one that welcome the various practices of the outsider, the poor, the immigrant, the old type of bohemian types, artists, African-American, gay, lesbian, all of that. I mean, I'm thinking of Merleau-Ponty now too, because I can't imagine Paris without so-called its cosmopolitan culture, without the Montmartre, without the Picasso, Braque, Apollinaire, Sylvia Beach, Alfred Jarry, Gertrude Stein, Alex B. Toklas, James Joyce. There was Narcissism, Surrealism. I can't imagine New York similarly in the 30s without the West Village, without the East Village. I can't imagine that would occur to the notion of cosmopolitanism or whatnot, So I'm just very confused when I came to New York in the late 80s, because I read about counterculture when I was in college. I read about Allen Ginsberg, Jonas Makers, Susan Sontag, all of them. And you well remember images that appear in Life magazine, in New York Times. Certainly you saw Marlon Brando, walking with James Bowen, with, Bob Dylan, John Baez, Allen Ginsberg, and black and white students protesting. What happened to that culture? Is it something the left had failed? They just didn't materialize their aspiration, as they did from the turn of the century, as they did during the Great Depression, as they did throughout those relentless efforts to making sure that American intellectual cultural life is part of the integrated whole with working class people. I remember Noam Chomsky saying that when he was growing up poor, his parents was very well educated. They went to play, they went to poetry reading, just like we read during the Great Depression. FDR created Federal for the Arts, the WPA. Library was open till midnight, accessible. They even have trucks and cars, driving books around so people can read them. I mean, what happened to us? What is this, that complacency? What is it that divides academia away from everything else? I'm saying this because it's partly personal to me in a way, because I think what we're trying to do the rail is to keep it free for a reason. Because I know this October, it will be 20th year that we're able to keep the rail free. And I know we have tremendous difficulties, greatest agonies when we apply grants, particularly the big foundation, big organization. You know they will never read it. We've been begging for anybody to come and pay site visit, to feel the people who's working at the rail, to meet them, to understand what we're doing. And it rarely happened. I remember talking to Jacques Reynolds. You know, when Jacques was working for Jim Melcher, he was, of course, at the National Project for the Arts in DC. He was sent to site visits across the US, and he was happy to do so with his wife, Suzanne Helmuth, and other people. I don't know what that happened there. People don't do that. It will be impossible to get foundation to support alternative voices like the rail, because everyone torture us. Who reads your paper? What is the demographic of the readership?
Sure.
So it's really the opposite. It's really the opposite of counterculture that I'm just describing.
Yeah. So, well, a couple of reactions. I was actually pretty impressed when I was at NEH, where I traveled a lot around the country. And I think you could say this for NEA as well. I was pretty impressed by how healthy and active the cultural sector was and is, as I saw it from that seat. I visited, I don't know, 30 states maybe across that 3-year period. And I met with museum directors, cultural societies of various kinds, historical associations, historic sites. And I was pretty surprised by and impressed by how vibrant that cultural community was and is in the United States. And I think a lot of that vibrancy and that growth has occurred since the 1960s, when I think the country opened up in a certain way. It's still very tough, and I'm very worried about the fate of these organizations in this terrible moment that we're in now, and what will happen to places like yours and others across the country, because it's obvious that it's going to be a very trying time for them. But both the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities were supporting a lot of these small organizations. Were they countercultural? Some of them were, but others are sort of preservationist in their impulses, community building in their impulses. When I was at Colby College in Waterville, Maine, I know the 2 or 3 most important institutions in that stressed community were cultural institutions. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just the college. There were other smaller organizations, downtown Waterville. A wonderful art house cinema, for example, was one of the most important at that time, and still is very important. Those kinds of places have lots of rich cultural activity going on in them. And God bless NEA and NEH and IMLS, the Museum and Library Agency, for supporting them, because the cultural work that they do is really important, not just in a kind of a preservation or curatorial sense, mm-hmm. but in a kind of provocative sense as well, which goes back to this notion of counterculture. I mean, when I came back from Vietnam, and the world was sort of blowing up in the United States, it wasn't just a political conflict that was emerging. It was a cultural conflict. Yeah. It had to do with what people valued fundamentally and what they found fundamentally valuable in American traditions. And it was liberating in many, many ways to be able to see something outside what was familiar and well known to us.
Yeah.
And it was a very, I don't know, explosive kind of situation across a number of years. I think that explosiveness sort of worked its way into the culture in certain ways and changed things for better and forever. Well, maybe not forever, nothing's forever, but for the good. And some of what we see in the cultural diversity in cities like New York is now, goes back to that time and that cultural energy that was let loose in the country. And some places like NEH and NEA have picked up on some of that energy and are now supporting it. I also think that, even though the current young generations of college students and recently graduated college students, even though those young people look different and act differently from the generations coming out of the 60s, I think there's still a lot of interesting dynamic going on in those young people. And I think there's a lot of deep thinking about primary cultural assumptions of American life. So I think in a less dramatic way, in a less perhaps provocative way, there's some very interesting things happening. And the rail is a good example of a cultural formation that has lots of allies and mobilizes lots of energy and activity in Brooklyn and more broadly in New York. But I think you can find things like that across the country. So I'm actually more encouraged than a lot of people are about the state of the counterculture or the state of cultural innovation in the United States, because I saw a lot of it when I was traveling around for NEH.
Well, I'm glad that you have such a optimistic view. I do too. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to work with my colleague to keep this thing free and alive this long, because it is it's interesting about going back to Dewey too, because one of the Dewey early admiring, of course, philosopher is Hegel. And Hegel, one of his very close associates is Schiller. And he, of course, was very much, became immersed in the philosophy of idealism, but later on repudiated it. But nevertheless, it's part of what the education of Dewey was. And I admire reading him now, because one thing stuck to me right now in my mind, he said once, Americans don't want to think, they want to know. Which brings to this whole necessity, which I'm very grateful to both Richard Rorty and people like Hilary Putnam, who was one very famous analytical philosopher, and decided to reverse their field of interest and began thinking of ways to speak to everyone, common language, as clear as possible. It's very inspiring, but that doesn't apply to all of their colleagues, especially younger people. You and I were talking the other day. I was agonizing to you, sharing my grief among my graduate students, whom always demanded a clear syllabus. They wanted to be told as if they are natural conformists. The one who able to adapt to my nonlinear way of thinking are the one who ended up to be artists. It's interesting to observe that. I also once make this experiment where I ask them to memorize a poem. Half will be reading from the book, the other half from the laptop. And the one who memorized poem from the laptop didn't remember anything. So that's very interesting experiment. So now we bring to the next question, specialization. I mean, it's deep in American psyche. We know that, either right or left. We know the whole political swing, like the pendulum. It's okay shoot out, really, at at the Corral, OK Corral in Arizona. We know that, but what is it in specialization by the early 70s, and I would even say by mid 70s, it became even more intense. You know, like postmodernism and everything else imported.
Right.
And then it became a norm, an expected norm for PhD higher education. And it got further away.
You're absolutely right. In the university world, specialization became, the name of the game, and graduate students were trained in increasingly specialized subfields of their disciplines, and they were expected to produce dissertations that were increasingly specialized. And then, not surprisingly, when we got out of graduate school, we were expected to and really wanted to teach those specializations that we had learned. In some ways, it's been a very good thing for certain kinds of scholarship because it's produced a lot of knowledge across the humanities and everywhere else, including especially, of course, the sciences. But there's been a huge price to pay for it. And I think the price has been paid in the educational domain, where specialization sort of took over the curriculum. And so we teach highly specialized subjects to undergraduates because that's what we did as academics when we were writing our dissertations, and that's what we know how to do now. And I think it made the curriculum not only more specialized, but narrower, and it made it more difficult to bring into the teaching that we do and should do the broad concerns of the world. So I think it's been really problematic, and especially in higher education. And I think we've got to find a way in teaching and in building curricula of institutions, particularly in the humanities, to get out of that graduate school specialization and to teach more generally topics that students can and want to engage in terms of what's going on around them in the world. I've been thinking a lot about, how should humanists be reacting and changing their work to this pandemic? I don't know the answer to that completely yet, but it's a fascinating and hugely important topic. And I would hope that next fall, if colleges and universities open next fall, what an incredible, mind-boggling thought it is that they wouldn't, that people will take up this thing that we're living through. Humanists certainly have a lot to say about this. I mean, scientists and social scientists, but so do humanists. And I hope that the curriculum will be inflected by what we've learned about this and what we've learned about ourselves, or what we still need to know about ourselves. So I think you're right, specialization is very important. It's been a big reason for the advancement of knowledge. At the same time, I think it's been problematic at the level of teaching.
Well, I just don't, maybe there's one more or two here before we open up, William, but there are over 4,000 colleges and universities across the US, and almost half of them are located in rural, poor America. And I can imagine before the arrival of the virus, we was working on a special issue called We the Immigrants. But we wanted to print at least 1 million New York State. It's very simple idea. It just accumulate every unique creative individual ever came to this country from the community of sciences and the arts and humanities. Even before the advent of photography, someone like Audubon and Femi were aware of who they were, so they have commissioned portrait made of them, either drawing or painting, whatnot. But otherwise, everyone came after, particularly the turn of the century, including Einstein, and I guess would be Hannah Arendt, the whole Frankfurt School. And then there in the visual art culture would be de Kooning, William de Kooning, Maxwell Gorky, Rothko, and so many people, I mean, today particularly too. So we wanted to put them together in the grid formation, like the way that Warhol Campbell soup were. Just essentially their face will be matching their last name of the 26th letter of the alphabet. And we wanted to print 1 million copy and we would like to urge, not in New York so much, not just the New York subway, the grocery shopping places or the bus and the street really. We wanted to mobilize through places like Ithaca where Cornell is, or, Vassar College and elsewhere, St. Rose. And we wanted to encourage the professor and their student to bring them to the people around the surrounding area. When was the last time they have any contact with the working class poor in rural America? Probably not many times, if not none, maybe. I don't know. But I know that when I came to Colby, receiving the award last summer, Leadership Award, spent some time with Sharon Cohen and Jessamine Batario, and the London Institute people too. I realized how poor Waterville is, where Colby College is located. And I know that you probably may have initiated, but to invite the London Institute and the family to invest in the town. So I could never fault your effort and what you have done there. But I think it's a very serious critical issue that the college professor and student and the working poor America don't have any dialogue whatsoever. And how do we initiate that? What could the National Endowment of the Arts and the Humanities, I know that it was created with a certain noble aim in mind. It was created in 1965, a year before you came back from Vietnam. But can it be the example par excellence? Could it mobilize and inspire smaller private foundation, almost even big foundation like the Mellon Foundation we talked just yesterday and others? Can there be ways in which they can support nonprofit? I'm speaking on behalf of the people I know in New York City, not just for the Brooklyn Rail to be published free, to allow as a platform for Martha Nussbaum, graduate student or Ph.D. student can write, can publish their voices. But I'm talking about all the very interesting and been around nonprofit, like, Artist Space, like Printed Matter, like Anthology Film Archives, all of the amazing institutions that also have perpetual difficult struggle to get funding. Does that sound reasonable, William, what I'm asking?
Well, I think places like NEH and NEA and big private foundations can do a lot to mobilize other organizations to approach certain kinds of problems or opportunities. And they can provide enormously powerful incentives for those rooted organizations to do different and new kinds of work. But they can't do the work itself. They can encourage, they can support, they can inspire, but it's the institutions that are out in the world that have to do that work, and they need resources to do it. But there's a limit to what a place like NEH or Mellon or Ford or any of these places can actually do. So it's places like Colby that are in these predominantly rural communities, non-urban communities, where some of the challenges of American life exist. It's those kinds of institutions that can really make that bridge, that can bridge to those populations. I don't think you can build the bridges unless you're of the place that you're trying to bridge to. So having a sense of place and a sense of connection through place is really the key. So there's a really critical role for NEH, NEA, and big private foundations. But there's an even more important role for local organizations, some of which have enormous national and international reputations. Colby is a national and international institution, and it is always looking out over the country and the world, but at the same time, it's got to be looking nearby. And I think that's true for all the big public and private colleges and universities in the country. To do the kind of work that you're talking about, they really have to get serious about doing that work. I think some of them are. And bridging these cultural differences that we have, particularly between urban and rural populations, that's not a perfect demarcation of where the cultural divide is in this country, but it is an important demarcation. And bridging that divide really has to involve real people in concrete places in those institutions doing that kind of work. And it's very hard. It's very hard work to do because the cultural backgrounds of people and of the institutions are very, very different. And we're working on very different kind of basic assumptions. But your organization, for example, is doing, embedded concrete work in your neighborhood. And that's great stuff. And that's what the NEHs and NEAs of the world need to be supporting, your kind of organization, because that's where the work happens. We did a very interesting project in Brooklyn at the library about and around immigration, and the Brooklyn Museum as well. And, those were projects that were connecting to new populations.
Yeah.
And they were very effective. I think the rural-urban divide is an even more complex divide.
Yeah.
And is going to take a different kind of mediation.
Yeah, I know from the get-go, William, when the rail was beginning to finding its own formation, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes everything that develops, it needs time. I think that the culture that sometimes puts so much pressure on young people to be pigeonholed, to be a specialized, niche that they must conform into. Sometimes it's really a detriment to their growth. I know, going back to Richard Rorty again, because it's fresh on my mind because I just reread Achieving Our Country, which is basically named after James Baldwin's book, By Next Time. That was published in 1998. He said, which I put it in my last editorial, he said, the non-suburban electorate will decide the system had failed and start looking around for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he's elected, the smug bureaucrats, tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, the postmodernist professor will no longer be calling the shots. That's a very strong statement. This is 1998.
It was prophetic.
It's very prophetic.
Yeah.
So I just feel this frustration over the years trying to keep the rail alive. Of course, it's a lifetime commitment. It's a calling. When you have a calling, that's what you do. This is what, again, I really love Schiller, who once said that I hunger, therefore the object becomes food. It's not because food lays before me that drives my hunger. And I think all the people that I wanted to connect, we want to connect as a living organism, is really having come from a culture where we respect the elderly. In Asia, that's what you do.
Yes.
So I think that somewhere in the 70s, that been cut completely out of the conduit of a cultural dialogue. And when we look at the older artists that we admire so much, actually a month ago, we have a panel where, Joan Jonas was on the panel, and I was trying to find a way to describe what she actually does. Is she a dancer, a video artist, a poet, an artist, a performing artist? And she just say, how about an artist? Call me an artist. And I think that's where the cross-pollination must be brought back to full fruition, to make it available for young people, because they are petrified. They are filled with anxiety. I don't think they want to be conformists either, but the pressure is so strong. No one really cared to work enough to help them to deal with complexity. Your generation, you the product of that complexity. You come in a long way to coming back dealing with Merleau-Ponty now and Cézanne. So my last question is this: with this COVID-19, this strange time occurring at the moment, which forces us to slow down. In this time of being slow, we are forced to be slow while nature is healing herself. And this is where the arts and humanity counts, because you couldn't accelerate an experience of reading a poem, looking at a painting, or being in a Mahler symphony. So this is where it counts. So what are ways in which we can respond readily without giving into the whole notion of speed, which is what people like Trump understand very well. Speed equal power. So in order to counter speed, we have to mobilize the slowness of the arts and the humanities. And which way can we do that? How many ways can we do that?
That question's a little above my pay grade, I think, but I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, you're right. It's a culture now of speed, and of course, the digital world both lends itself to that and amplifies that in a lot of different ways. And on the other hand, the humanities and the arts are kind of like a slow cooker,
Mm-hmm.
Those experiences of reading or of looking, of becoming acquainted with complicated cultural artifacts and objects is a time-bound experience, and
Mm-hmm.
it's very hard to accelerate it. You, because you're an artist, have seen, like I have, because I go to lots of museums, it's not uncommon now to see people in museums not really looking at things, but taking pictures of things.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of moving on from one object to the other once there's a picture. Now, I have to confess that I take pictures in museums too, because I like going back and looking at the objects or my representation of the object. It's not the same, but later. So there is a place for that. But I think you're right. Getting the speed of the culture and the speed of the society is not friendly to some of those more meditative, slow cooking modes of thinking and being that are represented by the arts and the humanities. You mentioned Cézanne.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody that knew him and he himself a little bit talked about how long it took him to make the things that he made.
Mm-hmm.
He was notoriously slow and worked over these objects for weeks and sometimes months and sometimes years. The great Bathers painting that's at the Barnes in Philadelphia, one of the great paintings in the history of the world, I think,
Mm-hmm.
was worked on for 5 years, over
Mm-hmm.
a period of 5 years. It's very tough to do these days. And I'm the first to say that there are some really wonderfully interesting digital art productions, artifacts, exhibits, all of the above. And I've learned a lot about that, having been in New York for a couple of years. And I admire that kind of work. I think it's terrific.
Yeah.
But there's also something to say about the preservation of these slower forms and teaching the importance of slow cooking, if you will, with a lot of these traditions that we're talking about.
Yeah, I like to respond to that, and we'll should open up to our listener, William. You mentioned Cézanne, and one of Cézanne's greatest attribute, if one can say it in one or two sentences, is his heroic struggle between his early anxiety. You remember early painting, they were painted with such exaltation of expressiveness. I mean, they were destructive themes. There was murder, there were rape, orgy at time even. And he knew if he was going to paint that way, he would never evolve himself as a painter of great endurance. So he created a kind of a project, almost like a religious conversion, that he had to, with the help, of course, with Pissarro, he began to look at everyday objects, no longer working from his imagination. So by looking routinely from a set of a still life, he was able to reduce the expressiveness or the anxiety and whatnot. So one thing that we can say, that's why the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional aspect, they collide. They coexist with an amazing struggle, and we feel that struggle. And that's why that we always admire his work so much. Similar when Émile Benoit, who interviewed him, and witnessed once in a dinner where Frank Hoffer, the protagonist of Balzac's famous novella, The Unfinished Masterpiece,
right?
The protagonist who trying to unify his both simultaneous interests, the period of life, which belonged to neoclassicism, like Ingres, for example, and then he was also interested in emotional resonant color, which is that of romanticism, Delacroix. And in the end, he destroyed it too. And I remember reading Émile Benoit, when Frank Hoffer's name came up, Cézanne stood up in tears in his eye and put his arm against his chest, says, Frank Hoffer, c'est moi. You know, yeah. I think that's a very important thing to encourage, I think particularly young students and artists, to deal with that simultaneous tension. And I like to bring this up because I think if we can inspire the dynamic interplay between subjectivity and objectivity, with neither one being the final determinant of truth value, you know? In fact, what is fact? This is a very interesting thing I like to say before we end this. What is fact, instead of allowing people to use alternative facts? And all the language that people use, breaking news, social distancing, and all of it. What is fact? According to most language, when you think about it, it's the product of labor. Fact is the product of labor. In German, it means thing done. In French, it means made. In Latin, it's called the similar thing. Things are made by hand, right? So it's a very interesting reference to Galileo in a letter he wrote to the painter named Giccoli. Galileo spoke of truth as a synthesis of the technique of the artisan, plus the knowledge of the artist. And I always love that. Go back to do it again. He never separated between academic study and vocational study. They should be simultaneously taught and valued. So thank you, William. I think we need part two. I think we need part two because this is the beginning of everything. Thank you. Back to you, Sophia.
Thank you both. And we have a bunch of questions lined up. So I would like to start with Taylor Bradley. If Taylor, you are still ready to ask your question, I'm going to unmute you. Let's see.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for for being with us today. I'm just scrolling up to my question. I was curious if you have any thoughts on viable alternatives to commercial and nonprofit models in the art world that can support the cultural life of the visual arts and humanities.
Well, only to say that, you know, having encountered lots of these very interesting small not-for-profits all over the country, I was impressed by how big that sector is, how many people are involved in it. Not very many people one at a time or one organization at a time, but across the entire country. And how impressive that sector is. You know, the art world is, having just been in New York for a couple of years, you know, you can't escape the intensity of the commercial domain of the art world in New York. And it's like that in almost every big city. And there's something, I suppose, exciting about that. But at the same time, I think most artists need a very different kind of infrastructure to help them do their work. And the rail is a good example of the kind of thing I'm thinking of. So multiplying those kinds of organizations, I think, is very important. The problem is, how do you do it? How do you get the resources to do it? I wish that foundations would step into that space a little bit more aggressively. And I wish that wealthy collectors and purveyors of art would step into that space a little bit more aggressively. But it's tough. I mean, it's hard to find those models, and it's hard to find lots of different cases where you could say they're really making a dent in that otherwise intensely commercial dimension of art. I don't know, Fong's probably got a better view on this than I, as an artist, than I do, but I wish there was more energy around that kind of work coming from, particularly from the foundation sector, and maybe from museums, though they have their own problems, as you know.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Oh, Taylor, did you want to say something else? No? Okay, awesome. So next I would like to go to Tom McGlynn. Tom, I'm going to unmute you.
Can you undo the video too, or redo the video? Nice to meet you, everybody, and excellent session. I think that I agree with Phong that I think it demands like a part two. Anyway, I was thinking about the 1959 book, The Lonely Crowd, in terms of like this theoretical portrait of the American type post-war. And David Reisman in the book identifies something he calls the outer directed individual. And he states that the outer directed individual would rather be loved than esteemed. So I'm wondering what you think about that, like in the sense of how do we, regarding Fong's questions about how do we establish or assemble this cultural solidarity and the ideal of the public intellectual, or how do we reconstruct the ideal of the public intellectual when the ideal is kind of maybe no longer a widespread value? I'm not saying that, but I think that there's a relationship between populist conformism and the autonomy of individual ideas. So in the United States, I think, you know, it could be said that there's this always been this level of conformism along with the whole myth of the maverick.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, like, if you think about this cultural moment with the rise in this kind of venal populism, kind of overtaking the idea of the public intellectual to a point where it's untenable or it's unimaginable.
Wow. Well, let's see.
Not to be cynical.
I mean, just a couple of thoughts. The populist energy that we're now encountering and experiencing seems to me, and is, I think, broadly acknowledged as being ferociously anti-elitist. So the energy of that populism has been very clearly directed at certain kinds of cultural elites, which include intellectuals, government leaders and officials, scientists, I think, to an increasingly worrisome degree, and I would say the art community, in a certain sense, to the degree that that's publicly associated with urban life and populations. You remember that exchange in the election when Ted Cruz talked to his Texas constituencies about New York values. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I think that kind of contempt for urban sort of cultural life is a part of this populism, and all of that's very disturbing because it's not clear how you speak to it. And some of the anti-scientific rhetoric that's been appearing in this pandemic situation, and it's hard to know how you even begin to get a purchase on that when the very condition of your speech is a certain position on expertise, right? On knowledge, and the importance of knowledge and expertise in speaking about certain kinds of things, which is one of the reasons I think these cultural tensions appear and feel so unbridgeable in our own setting, because the ground of assumptions, common assumptions, is just not there. So it's tough to think about how public intellectuals bridge that gap. There have been some people who have tried, and there have been some people who have written about bridging that gap. But I don't think so far it's been terribly effective. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to talk about bridging it, but it's much harder to do it, I think. And when I find myself trying to bridge it, sort of even in my own thinking, it's pretty challenging. So I'm not giving you a lot of definite answers, but I think those are some of the shapes of the problem that we're living through now.
And I want to follow that too, going back early on when you just made encouraging people with philanthropic impulse and great wealth, William. I remember clearly that sometimes we must speak simple truth and share it, in spite of the frustration. I think a certain kind of decorum and diplomacy sometimes can be served as a detriment to that truth, And I think there's people who have great wealth. I remember reading in New York Times several years ago when this woman named Ruth Lilly, who gave $2 million to Poetry Foundation Chicago. And what did they do with the money? They built a huge building, employ hundreds of people working the foundation. So all our poet friends never see any of it, And yeah. I know, I'm saying this because we were lucky enough to appeal to Philip Guston, the great painter, who's in 1970, his infamous show at the Marlborough Gallery in New York City, winter 1970, was the first time that he showed this incredible figurative, grotesque figure. He was attacked by the chief critic of the New York Times, Hilton Kramer. and none of the work was sold. He had to, at advanced age, already a very famous painter, to go back to teach at Boston University until he died in 1980. So that 10 years, he taught twice a day, twice a week. He'd take the bus up in, Boston University and teach. And it was the poets, younger poet, who came to his refuge to be friended with him, to give him some form of comfort, even confidence. William, I remember Bill Bergson, one of them, Clark Coolidge, William Corbett, and many others, Alex Notley and Wortman. These are people who really collaborate with him, gave him comfort. So I was able to convey that relationship to the daughter, Musa Mayer, who then underwrite the poetry section in the Rail. But when we appealed to the Poetry Foundation, I was warned by our great poet's friend, whether Charles Bernstein, the great poet who also founded Pensile, by Bob Holman, who founded, of course, Bowery Poetry Club, and Anne Wortman, all these amazing poet friends. The Poetry Foundation discouraged me to come visit them, nor they even care to come to visit the Rail. And that went around and back and forth for a year long. So I wanted to put it out there in the archive. So in case you listen to what I'm here, airing my frustration, hopefully they do more for the poetry, community. There's many pockets of poets in America, in San Francisco, in Philadelphia, in a smaller town, and they must support them, not to create this huge institution like a bureaucratic machine. That's where poetry dies.
There's nothing quite so underfunded as poetry, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia. I'm done with my frustration. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is a good moment to segue to our closing tradition, which the Rail has always done, which is ending our lunchtime conversation with a poem performed by one of our staff members. But first, I wanted to thank you both, William and Phong, for such an enriching conversation. I think it's very clear we have space for round two. And I'm sorry to everybody whose questions we didn't get to today. Now I will take it over to Charlie Schultz, who is our managing editor, and will be reading a poem for us today.
Hey everyone, thanks to Phong and William for that very stimulating conversation. I selected a poem today for the city that I love and do not get to live in at the moment. It's called Awakening in New York by Maya Angelou. It comes from her collection that was published in 1983, Shaker, Why Don't You Sing? Awakening in New York. Curtains forcing their will against the wind, children sleep, exchanging dreams with the seraphim. The city drags itself awake on subway straps, and I, an alarm, awake as a rumor of war, lie stretching into dawn, unasked and unheeded. Thank you, everyone.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, Phong. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, and I hope that we continue, because we barely scratched the surface of Merleau-Ponty, Cézanne, and others. So part 2 will be coming soon. Thank you.
Thank you.